What if I told you that sometimes the people who smile at you the most are the same ones slowly taking control of your life without you even realizing it? And the scariest part isn't what they do openly, it's what they do quietly, step by step, until one day you wake up and nothing around you feels like it belongs to you anymore, because that's exactly how it started for me. Not with a big argument, not with some dramatic moment, but with small changes, harmless suggestions, helpful decisions that didn't seem like a big deal at first, and maybe you've experienced this too, where someone begins by saying, "Let me help you," and before you know it, that help turns into control, and control turns into something you can't easily take back, because after my husband passed, my life became quieter than I ever imagined, not just silent, but structured in a way that made everything predictable, safe, manageable, and I told myself that was enough, that I didn't need anything more. That this was just the natural next phase of life. And for a while, I believed it. I really did, because believing it was easier than questioning it, easier than admitting that something felt missing. But here's what no one tells you: when your life becomes too quiet, too controlled, too predictable, it becomes very easy for someone else to step in and start making decisions for you. And at first, it feels comforting. Like you're being taken care of, like you're not alone anymore. And that's how it began with my children, slowly, gently, with concern in their voices and kindness in their actions, checking in more often, asking about my routine, offering to help with things I had been doing perfectly fine on my own for years. And I didn't question it. Why would I? They were my family, my own children, the people I trusted more than anyone else in this world. And when they suggested small changes, I agreed without hesitation, because it felt reasonable, it felt logical, it felt like the kind of support people always talk about, the kind you're supposed to be grateful for. And I was grateful, at least in the beginning, because it didn't feel like control yet, it felt like care. And there's a very thin line between those two, a line you don't notice crossing until you're already on the other side. Because one day it was, "Let me help you with your bills," and the next it became, "It's easier if I just handle everything for you." And I remember thinking it made sense, that it would reduce stress, that it was just one less thing to worry about, and I didn't realize that by handing over something so small, I was also handing over something much bigger: my independence, my authority, my control over my own life. And maybe you're thinking, why didn't I stop it? Why didn't I question it? But that's the thing, it didn't feel like something that needed to be stopped, not yet, because it didn't happen all at once. It happened slowly in ways that felt natural, in ways that made me feel cared for instead of controlled, and that's what made it dangerous. Because when something feels like love, you don't defend yourself against it, you accept it, you trust it. You let it in without realizing what it might turn into. And before I even noticed the shift, more things started changing. Decisions I used to make on my own were now being discussed, then suggested, then decided for me. And each time it came with the same tone, the same reassurance. "It's for your own good. We're just trying to help. You don't need to worry about these things anymore." And those words, they sound kind, they sound supportive. But if you hear them enough times, they start to carry a different meaning, one that slowly replaces your confidence with doubt. Because after a while, you start to question yourself, you start to wonder if maybe they're right. Maybe you don't need to handle everything anymore. Maybe it's easier to let someone else take control. Maybe this is just what happens at this stage of life. And that thought, it's the most dangerous one of all. Because the moment you start believing you don't need control over your own life, you've already begun to lose it. And I didn't realize how far things had gone until I noticed something that should have been obvious much earlier. I wasn't making decisions anymore, not real ones, not the ones that mattered. Everything important had quietly shifted into someone else's hands, and I was just going along with it, accepting it, adapting to it. And on the outside, everything still looked normal. I was still living in my house, still following my routine, still speaking the same way, acting the same way, but inside, something had changed, something felt off, like I was no longer fully in control of my own life. Like I was living inside a version of my life that someone else was shaping for me, and that realization didn't come all at once. It came in small moments. Moments that didn't seem significant at first, but stayed with me longer than they should have, like when I had to ask before making a decision that used to be mine, or when I noticed hesitation in my own thoughts. Like I was second guessing myself before even acting, and that's when it started to become clear, not obvious, but noticeable enough to make me uncomfortable, because I began to see the pattern, the slow, careful shift from independence to dependence, from control to compliance, and the more I saw it, the more I couldn't ignore it, but at the same time, I didn't react, I didn't confront it, I didn't push back, and maybe that sounds strange. Maybe you're wondering why I stayed quiet, why I didn't fight it the moment I noticed what was happening. But the truth is, I was watching, I was paying attention, I was learning, because something inside me wasn't as unaware as they thought. Something inside me hadn't given up control completely, not yet, and that's what they didn't understand, what they couldn't see behind my silence, behind my agreement, behind the way I nodded and went along with their decisions. Because while they believed I was becoming weaker, more dependent, easier to manage, I was doing something else entirely, something they didn't expect, something they didn't prepare for. I was noticing everything, every change, every decision. Every moment where control slipped just a little further out of my hands, and instead of stopping it, I let it happen, and that was the part that would later change everything because sometimes the strongest move isn't resisting immediately, it's understanding completely, and by the time they realized what was really happening, it was already too late. Because while they thought I had lost control, I was quietly learning exactly how to take it back, and they had no idea I was just getting started. What if I told you that control doesn't tighten all at once? It tightens so slowly that by the time you feel it, you're already caught in it. And the most dangerous part is, it still looks like love from the outside. Because after those first small changes, things didn't stop. They continued quietly, steadily, like a pattern forming right in front of me. And maybe you've seen this too, how something that begins as help slowly becomes expectation. And expectation turns into authority, and before you know it, you're no longer being asked, you're being told, and the strange part is it didn't feel aggressive, it didn't feel forced, it felt organized, controlled, almost planned. Like every decision was being made in a way that seemed logical on the surface, but underneath it was shifting everything piece by piece, and I started noticing it more clearly, not just in big decisions, but in the small everyday moments, the ones people usually ignore, like how my schedule began to change, how certain routines were adjusted for my comfort, how things I used to do freely now came with suggestions attached. And those suggestions, they weren't really suggestions anymore, they were directions disguised as care. And I could feel it, that subtle pressure, that quiet expectation that I would agree, that I would follow along, that I would accept what was being decided for me without questioning it. And for a while, I did exactly that. I played the role they expected. I nodded, I smiled, I said that makes sense. Even when something inside me didn't fully agree, and you might wonder why not speak up? Why not stop it before it went further? But here's the truth, reacting too early would have exposed me, and I wasn't ready for that. Because the more I observed, the more I realized this wasn't random, this wasn't accidental. This was intentional, not in a cruel way, not in a way they would admit, but in a way that showed they had already decided what my life should look like, and they were slowly shaping it into that version. And the more I saw it, the more careful I became. Because I understood something they didn't. I understood that power isn't just about control, it's about timing. And if I wanted to take my life back, I needed to understand exactly how they were taking it first. And that meant staying quiet a little longer, watching a little closer, letting them believe their plan was working, because the truth is, people reveal everything when they think they're in control. They stop hiding, they stop being careful. They start showing you exactly how far they're willing to go, and that's exactly what happened. Because as days turned into weeks, their confidence grew, their involvement became stronger, more direct, less subtle. And I started noticing something else, something even more concerning. Not just control, but restriction, because it wasn't just about helping me anymore, it was about limiting what I could do on my own. Like certain decisions being delayed until they were present, certain actions being questioned before I could take them. And it was always framed the same way, always presented as protection, always explained as concern. And if you've ever experienced this, you know how confusing that can be, because it doesn't feel like you're being controlled. It feels like you're being cared for, and that's what makes it so hard to challenge. Because how do you argue against someone who says they're doing everything for your own good? How do you push back without sounding ungrateful, without creating conflict, without questioning the very people you're supposed to trust the most? And that's the trap, the emotional layer that keeps you quiet, that keeps you compliant, that makes you second guess your own instincts. And I felt that too, I won't deny it. There were moments where I questioned myself, moments where I wondered if maybe they were right, maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe this was just what happens when you get older. Maybe this was normal, but deep down, something didn't sit right, something felt off in a way I couldn't ignore. Because control, no matter how gently it's presented, still feels like control, and your instincts don't lie about that, and the more I trusted that feeling, the clearer everything became, because I started connecting the dots, seeing how one decision led to another, how one helpful action created dependency, how one small shift made the next one easier to accept. And that's when it hit me. This wasn't about helping me live easier. This was about making me easier to manage. And that realization changed everything, not on the outside, not immediately, but inside, because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. Once you recognize what's happening, you can't pretend it's something else. And I stopped questioning whether I was imagining it. I stopped doubting myself. I stopped trying to justify their actions in a way that made them seem harmless, because they weren't harmless anymore. They were strategic, intentional, and slowly taking away something I had every right to keep: my independence. And that's when my perspective shifted completely, because I realized something important. They thought I was passive, they thought I was unaware, they thought I was slowly becoming dependent on them. But in reality, I was becoming more aware than ever. More alert, more focused, more prepared, and the more they tightened their control, the more I understood exactly how it worked, exactly where it was strongest, exactly where it was weakest, and instead of resisting it directly, I let it continue just enough to expose itself fully, because stopping something too early only hides how deep it goes, but letting it unfold reveals everything, and that's exactly what I needed. Because I wasn't just trying to react anymore, I was preparing to take everything back, and preparation requires patience, requires understanding, requires seeing the full picture before making a move. And by the time they thought they had everything under control, by the time they believed I had fully accepted my role in this new version of my life, I had already figured out something they hadn't even considered. Something that would change everything when the time was right, because while they believed I had no control left, that's exactly what I wanted them to think. What if I told you that every story like this has a moment, a single moment where everything stops feeling like maybe and starts feeling like the truth you can't ignore anymore? Because up until then, I was still observing, still patient, still letting things unfold so I could understand them completely. But there comes a point where understanding turns into realization, and realization turns into something much heavier. Something you can't just watch anymore, something that forces you to decide who you really are in your own life. And that moment came for me in a way I didn't expect, not loud, not dramatic, but sharp enough to cut through every excuse I had been making for them, because it wasn't just about decisions anymore, it wasn't just about control. It became about respect, about dignity, about whether I was still seen as a person or just a responsibility they needed to manage. And tell me honestly, have you ever felt that shift, that quiet realization that people are no longer asking what you want? They're deciding what you should want and expecting you to accept it without question, because that's exactly what happened. And it started like any other day, ordinary, predictable, nothing out of place on the surface. But underneath, something was already building, something I hadn't fully acknowledged yet, because when control grows slowly, the breaking point doesn't feel obvious at first. It feels like just another moment, until suddenly it isn't. And that's what happened when I overheard a conversation I wasn't meant to hear, not intentionally, not something they said directly to me, but something said casually, confidently, like it was already decided. Like my voice didn't need to be part of it, and the words themselves weren't loud, they weren't aggressive. They were calm, practical, almost logical, but the meaning behind them hit harder than anything else. Because they were talking about my life like it was something to organize, something to manage, something to adjust for convenience. And in that moment, everything became clear, not gradually, not slowly, instantly. Because I realized something I hadn't fully accepted before. They weren't just helping me anymore, they were replacing me in my own life. And that realization didn't come with anger at first, it came with something else. Something quieter but deeper: disappointment, because it's one thing to be controlled by strangers. It's another thing entirely when it comes from the people you trusted the most, the people who are supposed to support you, not override you. And standing there, hearing that conversation unfold as if my opinion didn't matter, as if my presence wasn't even necessary in decisions about my own life, I felt something shift inside me. Something that had been building quietly finally reaching the surface. Because this wasn't about misunderstanding anymore. This wasn't about overthinking. This was real, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. And for a brief moment, I felt the urge to confront it, to step in, to stop it immediately, to remind them that I was still capable, still aware, still in control of my own choices. But I didn't. And that decision, that pause, was more powerful than any reaction I could have had in that moment. Because instead of reacting emotionally, instead of giving them a chance to explain, to justify, to soften what I had just realized, I chose something else. I chose clarity. I chose to let that moment settle, to fully understand what it meant, because reacting too quickly would have only addressed the surface. But I needed to understand the depth, and the depth was this: they didn't see me the same way anymore. They didn't see me as someone in control. They saw me as someone who needed to be controlled. And that shift in perception, that was the real problem, because once people start seeing you that way, everything they do changes. Every decision, every action, every word is shaped by that belief. And if I didn't change that perception, nothing else would change either. And that's when the real turning point happened, not outside, not in front of them, but inside me, because in that moment, I stopped waiting for things to go back to normal. I stopped hoping this was temporary. I stopped telling myself that this would fix itself over time, because it wouldn't, not unless I did something about it. And that realization came with a different kind of feeling, not anger, not fear, but determination, the kind that doesn't show on the outside but changes everything on the inside. Because I understood something very clearly in that moment. If I didn't take control back, I would lose it completely, not just in small ways, not just in daily decisions, but in the bigger picture. In the way my life would continue from that point forward. And I wasn't willing to accept that, not anymore, not after everything I had seen, everything I had understood, everything I had quietly observed up until that point. Because once you see the truth clearly, you can't go back to pretending it doesn't exist, and I didn't want to pretend anymore. I didn't want to play along. I didn't want to slowly fade into a version of myself that someone else had created for me, and that's when something inside me changed completely, something that had been silent for too long finally finding its voice, not loud. Not obvious, but strong, steady, certain, and that certainty brought something with it, a plan, not fully formed yet, not detailed, but present, because the moment you decide to take your life back, your mind starts working differently. It starts looking for ways, for opportunities, for strategies, and that's exactly what mine started doing, because I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't confront them directly, not yet, not without preparation, not without understanding exactly how to shift the balance back in my favor, because this wasn't just about speaking up. This was about taking back control in a way that couldn't be taken away again, and that required patience, precision, and timing. And as I stood there, processing everything I had just realized, one thought became clearer than anything else. I wasn't their victim anymore, not mentally, not emotionally, not even quietly, because that night, something changed permanently, something that would shape everything that happened next, because that night, I stopped being controlled and started becoming something they never expected me to be. What if I told you that the most powerful moves are the ones no one sees coming, the ones that happen in silence, behind calm expressions, behind polite agreement, behind the version of you that everyone thinks they understand? Because after that moment, after everything became clear, I didn't explode, I didn't confront them, I didn't argue or try to prove anything, and maybe that's what they expected, maybe that's what they were prepared for. Because it's easy to handle resistance when you can see it. It's easy to control someone who reacts emotionally, who shows their frustration, who reveals their intentions too early, but I didn't do any of that. I did something far more dangerous. I stayed exactly the same on the outside, and that's the part they completely underestimated because they thought nothing had changed. They thought I was still the same person quietly accepting everything, still following along, still letting them lead, and that illusion, it gave me everything I needed because when people think they've already won, they stop being careful, they stop watching closely, they start acting freely. And that's when they reveal the most, and I was ready for that. I was paying attention to everything now, not just what they said, but how they said it, not just what they did, but when they did it, every decision, every pattern, every moment where control tightened just a little more, because now I wasn't observing to understand anymore. I was observing to act, and maybe you've experienced this shift too. That moment where you stop reacting emotionally and start thinking strategically, where you realize that timing matters more than urgency, and patience becomes your greatest strength. Because I knew I couldn't take my life back with one conversation, one argument, one emotional outburst. This had gone too far for that. This required something else, something calculated, something undeniable. Something that would shift the balance completely, not temporarily, but permanently, and that meant I needed information, I needed clarity, I needed to know exactly where I stood and exactly what had been changed without my full awareness. And the more I looked, the more I found, and what I found confirmed everything I had already felt, because control leaves traces. It always does, small signs that something has been adjusted, something has been redirected. Something has been quietly moved out of your hands, and I started noticing those signs everywhere, in documents, in decisions, in things that had been handled for me without my full involvement. And each discovery didn't shock me anymore. It strengthened me because it showed me how far this had gone, and the further it had gone, the clearer my next move needed to be, because this wasn't about taking small things back anymore. This was about reclaiming everything, and that required precision, not emotion. And I started preparing in ways they couldn't see, small steps at first, things that looked normal on the surface but had a deeper purpose, organizing things, reviewing things, asking questions in ways that didn't sound like questions, because the key wasn't to alert them. The key was to stay invisible while becoming stronger. And the more I did that, the more confident I became. Because I could see the structure of everything they had built around me, I could see where it was strong, where it was weak, where it depended on my silence. And that's when I realized something important. Their control only worked as long as I stayed passive, as long as I didn't challenge it in a meaningful way, and the moment I did, everything would shift, but it had to be the right moment. Because acting too early would only give them time to adjust, to defend, to rebuild control in another form, and I wasn't going to let that happen, not after everything I had understood and while I was preparing. Something else was happening too. They were becoming more comfortable, more confident, more open about their control, because from their perspective, everything was working perfectly. I wasn't resisting, I wasn't questioning, I wasn't pushing back. I was exactly what they thought. I had become manageable, and that belief made them careless in ways they didn't even notice. And that carelessness, it gave me the final pieces I needed, because when people think you're no longer a threat, they stop protecting themselves from you, and that's when you have the greatest advantage. And I used that advantage carefully, quietly building everything I needed without creating suspicion, without changing my behavior in ways that would raise questions, because the goal wasn't just to take control back, it was to do it in a way they couldn't undo. And that's the difference between reacting and reclaiming. One is temporary. The other is permanent, and I was done with temporary. I wasn't interested in small wins or short term control. I wanted my life back completely, without conditions, without interference, without anyone else deciding what was best for me. And the closer I got to that moment, the clearer everything became, because I could see it now, the exact point where everything would shift, the exact moment where the balance would change. And they wouldn't see it coming, not because they weren't capable, but because they never believed I would do it. They never believed I was preparing. They never believed I was anything other than what they had convinced themselves I was. And that assumption, that underestimation, it was their biggest mistake, because while they were watching me casually, thinking they understood me completely, they had no idea I was watching them just as closely, just as carefully, just as intentionally, and by the time they realized what was happening, I wouldn't just be reacting anymore, I would already be in control again. And everything they thought they had built around me would start falling apart one decision at a time. What if I told you that the moment people feel most confident is the exact moment they make their biggest mistake? Because confidence makes you careless, it makes you assume nothing can go wrong. It makes you believe the situation is already under control, and that's exactly what happened with them, because by the time I had finished preparing, by the time I understood every detail, every decision, every quiet shift they had made in my life, they had stopped paying attention completely, not because they didn't care, but because they believed there was nothing left to watch, nothing left to manage, nothing left that could surprise them. And that belief, it gave me the perfect opening, because when someone thinks you're predictable, they stop expecting change, and change is most powerful when it's unexpected, and I could feel it building, that moment getting closer. Not emotionally, but strategically, like everything I had been quietly putting together was finally aligning in a way that made sense, in a way that gave me clarity, not just about what I needed to do, but when I needed to do it. Because timing is everything, especially when you're dealing with people who think they're in control, and I wasn't rushing anymore, I wasn't reacting, I was waiting. Waiting for the moment where their confidence would peak just enough for them to lower their guard completely. And that moment came in a way that almost felt too perfect, because they started making decisions faster now, bigger decisions. Ones that didn't even try to include me anymore, ones that assumed my agreement without asking. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, you know exactly what that feels like. That quiet realization that you're no longer part of the conversation, you're the subject of it. And that realization should have made me angry, it should have made me react, but instead, it did the opposite. It confirmed that I was ready. Because they had reached the point where they believed I had no control left at all, and that belief, that's what I needed, because the stronger their assumption, the bigger the impact when it broke, and I let them go just a little further. Just enough to expose everything completely, just enough to make sure there was no confusion about what was happening, no way for them to deny it, no way for them to adjust before it was too late. And maybe you're wondering why I didn't stop it sooner, why I allowed it to reach that point. But the truth is, stopping something halfway only leaves room for it to return, and I wasn't interested in temporary fixes. I wanted final change, the kind that couldn't be reversed with another conversation or another helpful suggestion. And as they moved forward with their plans, more openly now, more confidently, I stayed exactly the same on the outside. Calm, cooperative, predictable, giving them no reason to question anything, because the moment they started questioning me, the advantage would shift back to them, and I wasn't going to risk that. Not after everything I had done to reach this point, and then it happened, the moment I had been waiting for, not dramatic, not loud, but clear, undeniable. The kind of moment where everything aligns perfectly, and you know without any doubt, this is it. This is where everything changes. And I remember feeling something unexpected in that moment, not fear, not hesitation, but clarity. The kind that removes all doubt, all second guessing, all hesitation, because when you've prepared properly, when you've understood everything fully, the moment of action doesn't feel chaotic, it feels precise. And I knew exactly what I needed to do, not emotionally, not impulsively, but deliberately. And as I made my move, as I stepped into that moment with full awareness, something shifted immediately, not just in the situation, but in me, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't reacting to what was happening, I was directing it, and that difference, it changes everything. Because when you take control back intentionally, not emotionally, not out of anger, but out of clarity, it doesn't just affect the moment. It affects everything that follows, and I could see it in their reaction, the confusion, the hesitation. The sudden realization that something wasn't going according to their expectations, because they hadn't prepared for this version of me. They hadn't planned for resistance that didn't look like resistance. They hadn't expected me to step forward with certainty instead of doubt, and that's what made it so powerful because it wasn't just about what I did. It was about how I did it, calm, steady, undeniable, leaving no room for negotiation, no space for them to take control back. And in that moment, the balance shifted completely, not gradually, not slowly, instantly. Because control doesn't need to be taken piece by piece when you've already understood the entire structure, sometimes. It just needs one precise move to break everything at once, and as I stood there, watching that realization settle in for them, watching their confidence turn into uncertainty, their certainty turn into questions, I understood something very clearly. This wasn't just a reaction anymore, this was a turning point. The kind that doesn't go back, the kind that changes everything from this moment forward. And the most powerful part of it all was that they never saw it coming, not because they couldn't, but because they never believed I was capable of it. And that belief, that underestimation, was exactly what allowed me to take everything back in a way they couldn't stop, because while they thought they were controlling my life, I was preparing to rewrite it completely. And now there was nothing left holding me back. What if I told you that the moment you finally take your life back doesn't feel loud or dramatic the way you imagined? It feels quiet, steady, almost unreal. Like standing in a place you used to belong to but had forgotten existed. Because after I made that move, after everything shifted in a single, undeniable moment, there wasn't chaos, there wasn't shouting. There wasn't the kind of reaction you see in movies. There was silence, the kind of silence that comes when something changes so completely that no one knows how to respond right away, and maybe you felt that too. That moment where the balance of power shifts so suddenly that even the people who thought they were in control don't know what to say anymore. And that's exactly what happened. Because for the first time since all of this began, they weren't directing the situation anymore, they were reacting to it, and that difference, it changes everything because when people are used to being in control, they rely on that control to feel confident, to feel certain, to feel like they understand what's happening. But the moment that control is taken away, everything becomes uncertain for them, and I could see it clearly. Not just in their words, but in their expressions, in the way they paused before speaking, in the way they tried to adjust to something they hadn't prepared for. And for the first time, I wasn't the one adapting, they were. And that realization didn't make me feel powerful in the way you might expect. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like clarity, like everything had finally settled into place, like I was exactly where I was supposed to be all along. Just without the confusion that had surrounded me before. And as I stood there, calm, steady, fully aware of what I had just done, I realized something important. This wasn't just about taking control back from them. It was about taking control back from the version of myself that had allowed this to happen in the first place, not out of weakness, but out of trust, out of comfort, out of a belief that things would stay balanced on their own. And maybe you've experienced that too, that moment where you realize it's not just about what others did, it's also about what you allowed, and that realization doesn't come with blame, it comes with responsibility. The kind that doesn't weigh you down but pushes you forward, because once you accept that, once you understand your role in it, you also understand your power to change it. And that's exactly what I had done, not just externally, but internally, because the biggest shift wasn't in the situation. It was in me, in the way I saw myself, in the way I understood my own place in my life. Because for a long time, without realizing it, I had slowly stepped back. Not completely, but enough for others to step forward, enough for decisions to be made without me, enough for control to shift without resistance. And now, that had changed completely permanently, and the more I stood in that new space, the more I could feel it, that sense of independence returning, not as something new, but as something that had always been mine, something I had simply stopped holding onto as tightly as I should have. And it felt different now, stronger, clearer. More defined because it wasn't based on assumption anymore. It was based on awareness, and awareness changes everything. because once you see how control works, once you understand how it can be taken and how it can be reclaimed, you don't just go back to the way things were before. You move forward with something stronger, something more intentional. And I could see that in the way things unfolded after that moment because they didn't argue the way I expected. They didn't push back as hard as I thought they would, not because they agreed, but because they were adjusting, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to figure out how to respond to a version of me they hadn't seen before. And that hesitation, it gave me space to reinforce what I had done, space to establish a new dynamic, space to make it clear, without raising my voice, without creating conflict, that things were different now. That the control they thought they had was no longer theirs, and I did it calmly, consistently, without reacting to their confusion, without getting pulled back into old patterns, because the key wasn't just taking control back, it was keeping it. And keeping it requires something different than taking it. It requires consistency, clarity, and the ability to stay grounded even when others are trying to figure out how to shift things back to the way they were. And there were moments, small ones, where I could feel that pull, that subtle attempt to return to the old dynamic, to reintroduce control in quieter ways. But this time, I saw it immediately, I recognized it, and I didn't allow it, not with anger. Not with resistance, but with certainty, the kind that doesn't need to argue because it's already decided, and that certainty became my strength, not just in that situation, but in everything that followed, because once you reclaim your life, you don't just reclaim control, you reclaim your voice, your presence, your ability to exist fully in your own decisions, and that changes how everything feels, how everything looks, how everything moves forward. And as I settled into that new reality, as I allowed myself to fully experience what it meant to be in control again, I realized something I hadn't expected. This wasn't just an ending. It wasn't just the conclusion of something that had gone too far, it was the beginning of something else, something I hadn't fully considered yet. Because taking your life back doesn't just restore what you had before, it opens the door to what comes next. And standing there in that moment of clarity, of control, of quiet confidence, I couldn't help but wonder, what would I do with it now? What would I choose now that the decision was fully mine again? Because for the first time in a long time, there was nothing stopping me anymore. And that kind of freedom, it changes everything. What if I told you that taking your life back isn't the end of the story? It's the moment the real question finally begins, because after everything shifted, after the control was gone, and the silence that followed settled into something calmer, something clearer, I found myself standing in a space I hadn't truly experienced in years, a space where every decision was mine again, where no one was guiding me, correcting me, or quietly shaping things behind the scenes. And at first, that kind of freedom feels almost unfamiliar, like stepping into a room you used to live in but haven't entered for a very long time. Everything looks the same, but it feels different because you're different. And maybe you felt that too, that strange mix of relief and uncertainty when you finally get back something you didn't even realize you had lost, because freedom sounds simple, but living with it again requires something deeper. It requires trust, not in others, but in yourself. And that was the real challenge I hadn't expected, not facing them, not taking control back, but facing myself. Asking myself what I actually wanted now that I had the ability to choose again. Because for so long, my life had been shaped around routines, expectations, and quiet acceptance. And suddenly, all of that was gone, replaced with something much more powerful: possibility. And possibility can feel overwhelming when you haven't allowed yourself to think about it in years, because it forces you to confront questions you've been avoiding. Questions like, what kind of life do I want now? What kind of decisions will I make? What parts of myself have I been holding back without even realizing it? And those questions don't come with easy answers. They come with reflection, with honesty, with a level of awareness that most people avoid because it requires you to truly see yourself, not the version others expect, not the version you've grown comfortable with, but the version that's still evolving, still capable of change, still capable of becoming something new. And that realization, it changed everything for me. Because I understood something I hadn't fully grasped before, that taking my life back wasn't just about removing control. It was about redefining it, about deciding what control actually means to me, about creating a life that isn't built on reacting to others, but on choosing for myself. And once I saw it that way, everything became clearer, not easier, but clearer, because I stopped looking at what had happened as something negative, something to regret, something to dwell on, and started seeing it as something else entirely: a turning point, a moment that forced me to wake up, to pay attention, to reconnect with parts of myself I had quietly set aside. And in that sense, it gave me something valuable, something I might not have found otherwise, because sometimes it takes losing control to understand how important it really is. And as I moved forward, as I began making decisions again, Small ones at first, then bigger ones. I noticed something I hadn't felt in a long time: confidence, not loud, not obvious, but steady, grounded. The kind that doesn't need validation because it comes from knowing you're acting in alignment with yourself. And that confidence didn't just change how I made decisions, it changed how I saw everything, how I interacted with people, how I responded to situations. Because when you know you're in control of your own life, you stop seeking permission, you stop second guessing, you stop shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's expectations. And that shift, it's powerful. Not because it changes the world around you instantly, but because it changes how you move within it. And that's what I began to notice, not just in myself, but in the way others responded to me. Because once you change your own perception, others adjust to it too. Not always immediately, not always easily, but inevitably, because people respond to the energy you carry. And when that energy is grounded in certainty, in clarity, in self respect, it changes the dynamic completely. And that's what I carried forward: not anger, not resentment, not a need to prove anything, but a quiet understanding of who I am and what I'm willing to accept and what I'm not. And that understanding became my foundation, something I could rely on no matter what situation I found myself in, because I knew now that control isn't something you give away once and lose forever. It's something you can reclaim, rebuild, and strengthen if you're willing to face the truth and act on it. And standing there, looking at everything that had changed, everything that had unfolded, everything that had brought me to this point, I realized something that felt both simple and profound at the same time. Life doesn't stop giving you choices, no matter your age, no matter your situation, no matter how long you've been living a certain way. There's always a moment where you can decide to take your life back, to step forward instead of staying where it's comfortable, to choose growth over routine, to choose yourself over expectations. And that's the choice I made, not just once. Not just in that moment, but every day after that, because taking your life back isn't a single decision, it's a commitment, a continuous act of choosing yourself again and again, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it challenges what others expect from you, even when it forces you to step into something new. And maybe that's the real question this story leaves you with, the one I didn't fully understand until I lived it. If you realized that your life was slowly being shaped by others, if you felt that quiet loss of control, that subtle shift away from who you really are, would you notice it? And more importantly, would you have the courage to take it back? Or would you stay where it feels safe, even if it no longer feels like your life anymore?